Pacific community or like Indian community are more able to form parties which primarily represent their unique policies, their unique views as a minority. This is likely to occur because the fear of losing your vote is gone, and secondly, minorities that normally support other parties can now swing their vote because they're not scared of losing their vote towards a party that will primarily benefit them. For example, if you're a part of the Pacifica community, you don't have to vote for Labour anymore to get secondary benefits from their policy. You can now vote for the political party, the Pacifica Party, which is actually going to represent you as a primary benefit in Parliament. We see this as way better because it means that party is more likely to primarily represent you, and you're more likely to get primary representation in Parliament and have the political discourse surrounding your issues in the world, which you identify with. On the comparative, we don't get this representation with the status quo because people have to vote for parties which represent secondary views to you because we don't have the ability for people to vote for minority parties at the moment. So outcomes to this point, we're going to have more small parties developing because we're more likely to have more people being able to vote and like rely on parties to get into Parliament, and also because of this, we're less likely to have one Parliament, like one party governments occurring, like we've seen with the Labour government. This is really important because we have seen in the past, even though it might not happen with Labour, that like in the past, when a party has had the significant majority vote, they have been able to cut off progression in like society. They've been able to cut off other parties' votes because they're able to get the majority vote on most of the law changes that they want to make. We think this is really important to be able to cut down the size of these parties, introduce more minority parties which can uphold discussion of all people in New Zealand. We also get the chance that minority parties are more likely to be the kingmakers, like related to FDLY, because if we have lots of small parties that want to form a coalition, then there's more chance that these parties are going to be upheld more in society. People are going to like be able to see very clearly through media what these parties represent, who they are. We see that we're more likely to get more discourse about who these people are and like how we represent them. So overall, we get more representation. My second point. So we increase engagement in politics. Because we've identified that people are able to vote for things that they primarily want, because there are going to be small parties, we see that when people like vote for these parties, they're rooting behind them more so because they identify behind these parties. What this means is, as a person who votes for these minority parties, you're more likely to follow like politics and like the media, so that you can see how your voice is actually influencing society. There's a lot of disenfranchised people who currently do not vote because they do not have a party they identify with, and now able to do so. This is really important because, again, it means we're upholding democracy, it means we're giving all people a say, and it means we're engaging more people in politics. Outcomes, also would like to say that if you're more engaged in politics, you're also more likely to like go to protests, sign petitions, like volunteer for the party that you like. We see this upholds more political discourse in society than we currently have, and therefore is more healthy as a democratic system for us to have. We do not see this on the other side of the house. We see that the status quo limits minorities from being able to get into government. We see it limits the amount of people who can have their say in Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that speech. Our next panelist, Maddie Nash, supports the Hurricanes, and her favorite film is Cats 2019. To introduce the Hawke's Bay team's case, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker, Ned Broen.
The purpose of a democratic government like ours is to be there for New Zealanders, to deliver better outcomes for New Zealanders and improve the lives of people on the ground. Hawke's Bay is very proud to support a system that protects that democracy, that improves the lives of New Zealanders on the ground and makes our democratic process more conducive to good debate, good policy, and thus good outcomes. We win this debate then when we prove to you that the New Zealand government becomes more convoluted, more polarised, and thus less efficient if we implement SIDAV's model. What do we stand for in this debate? We stand for maintaining the 5% threshold for parties to get into government. We think that in instances when enough people vote for a small party to get them across the line, like the Green Party, the ACT Party, or the Māori Party, for example, then they absolutely should be in Parliament. And we also support like the existing electoral voting system. 2 points for you today. Firstly, why small parties won't have power in government, and secondly, why it will make Parliament far less effective. Before those, some rebuttal. Firstly, on the point of how SIDAV gets better representation, 3 responses for you today. Firstly, we tell you that that individuals don't need a specific party in order to be represented. We actually think it's far more better for minorities if they have a minority person that represents them to be at the table of these big parties. For example, Māori people benefit hugely by having Calvin Davis at the head of the Labour Party table, same way that Pacifica people benefit from having Carmel Sepuloni at that same table. Secondly, though, we tell you that minorities don't always have the exact same political beliefs. Like that was totally overlooked by the opposition, whereby they just assume that all Pacifica people have the exact same beliefs, and that they will just vote for the exact same party. That's a massive eradication of the individuality that all of these people hold. We don't see why they would all just have the exact same views. And thirdly, all of this material, all of it was contingent on them proving that these minority parties actually have power, which looks like being in government, right? We tell you 2 reasons why this isn't the case. Firstly, they're just more likely to be a random backbencher in government with 1 or 2 seats, in which case they don't have much power. And secondly, in the instances they told us where they might be kingmakers, we tell you this just doesn't manifest, right? The difference between parties and elections usually is 5 to 10 seats, big differences, in which case these parties are likely going to get 1 or 2 seats because they weren't getting 5% previously, in which case you would need multiple of these small parties which previously got into government on their side to be these kingmakers, so their kingmaker argument either is diluted or it doesn't exist. Second point then, onto engagement. This wasn't made particularly well, but they told us that if people have their own party to engage with, that they will be more enfranchised. We tell you that the number 1 reason why people aren't enfranchised with politics at the moment is because it's so complex and so complicated. If you open up the political discourse to include 20 more parties, for example, all that's going to do is make people who previously weren't that interested in Parliament, in politics, less likely to get involved, because there's more parties to look at, more research to do, that's more work. People who previously didn't want to get involved in politics or weren't that interested in it aren't going to be any more enfranchised on their side. They're just going to distance themselves further away from it because it's more complicated and it's more scary for them to go out and understand. So therefore, the 2 benefits, that they gave us do not stand in this debate. On to our substantial points. First point as to why small parties won't have power in government. 3 reasons for this. Firstly, for all of AF's benefits to accrue, they have to prove that these small parties will actually have a significant amount. Already told you why that's the case. 3 reasons to substantiate this. Firstly, the number of voters that these parties will have will be small, right? If they had lots of voters, they would be past the 5% threshold under our side, which means they won't be able to form a government. They won't be able to which means you're going to likely be in opposition, or they're going to be just a random irrelevant party in a coalition. Let's explore both of those outcomes. Firstly, if they're in opposition, they're going to have 1 or 2 seats in Parliament, not much voice, not much funding, not much resources, doesn't have power. Or if they're in a coalition, they're going to have far less leverage when negotiating for their policy, to form that coalition. So that doesn't stand either. Second though, small parties currently get power through members' bills. Take the ACT Party, where the euthanasia bill that David Seymour put through is what gave them that party. All you get on their side is a massive influx of members' bills, because currently on the status quo, parties prioritise what members' bills they want to get through. They put resources and funding behind those, and they focus on getting cross-party support on those members' bills. If you have all these parties now in Parliament, all they're going to do is push their own members' bills. It's harder to rally behind a few of them, so they don't get power in that sense. And thirdly, on representation, I've already talked quite a lot about this, but we get far more better representation on our side because we get minority people in the big seats on the big tables, right? That means they're far more likely to advocate and deliver outcomes for these people. We think it's better to have them in those positions versus a comparative where you just have minorities in an irrelevant spot in our government. So then on to our second point as to why it will lead to a less efficient democratic system. So know that the more that they try and prove that small parties have power in government, the more that they prove that that the democratic process will be less efficient. Here's why this is the case. Firstly, on coalitions, let's take a look at the New Zealand Green Labour coalition, which we just saw. Labour weren't able to progress many of the policies which they promised to voters because they had to sacrifice it at the negotiating table when New Zealand first was a kingmaker in that election. Secondly, let's look at 2008 when National negotiated with United Future. They didn't get barely any of their policy through because they were small and had no leverage. So in either outcomes, when these parties are either big or small, they still don't get much of their policy through. Therefore, what you get on side F, like either outcome, you're not going to get a whole lot of leverage where these small parties can get their policy through. This means that you just have more parties in the coalition with less policy. All that does is means you have more interest in that coalition, more voices in that coalition, more confusion in that coalition, which means you get slower policy, more internal instability, and voters who are left with broken promises because the parties that they voted for had to trade off those promises in order to form a government. None of those outcomes are things that we support. Hawke's Bay is very proud to not stand against them. And secondly, though, in on-side F's world, you get far more polarization in government, right? Because you have a lower threshold to get into government, it means that you're going to have more extreme parties in government. The left of the Green Party, which might be 1 or 2%, are going to vote for a party even left of that. The same way the right of ACT are going to vote for like a radical right party. This means that you have a greater span of political parties and a greater span of the political spectrum in our government. This is actually a really bad thing. Why is this a case? Well, because as like the major, more moderate parties like National or Labour, for example, chase after those votes which they lost to the extremes, they slowly shift away from the moderate, more centrist positions that they had before because our systems become more polarized. So this is, and plus you just get more representation of really radical parties. So that's why we get more polarization. Why is this really bad then? Because it means you have more division and polarization between the two, like left and right in political politics. We see this in America, for example, where there's massive amounts of disunity between the Republicans and Democrats because their voter bases and their political ideologies are so far apart that they can never agree or negotiate on anything. The outcomes of this then is that you get less cross-party agreements, which is incredibly important. Like take the gun reform that we passed 2 years ago, for example, where all the parties except ACT and government rallied behind it because it was an objectively good piece of policy. That just doesn't happen on their side because these parties have shifted further apart. There's more division between them and they're less inclined to go out and work with each other. There's far less incentive there because they agree on far less. So that doesn't happen on the comparative. So you get a far more polarized, less efficient democratic system, and also you get all the harms of having like diluted minority voices and irrelevant parties that all they do is get into parliament, but they have no power, they do nothing, their material cannot stand in this debate.
Thank you for that speech. Our next panelist, Shaked Noy, is distantly related to Karl Marx and holds 4 passports. I'd like to welcome up the second speaker from the affirming team, Julia Randerson.
Panel. One of the core values that is crucial to our society in New Zealand is democracy. It is a fundamental principle because we say that you deserve to have a say in the power which rules over you and dictates the way that you live your life. When people's views are arbitrarily gatekept because of this threshold, that is something that we cannot stand for on the affirmative team. 3 things to do in my speech today. Firstly, talk to you about how we improve representation on our side, and I have my split included within this point. Secondly, talk to you about efficiency and why we still have the same efficiency on our side of the house, if not better. Finally, then, on political engagement, sorry. So let's talk about representation first, because we tell you that you get more people's views represented when there simply are more parties in Parliament, so they don't have to compromise on, like, the Labour Party, which half supports their views, rather vote for top, which definitely would. They don't vote for top because they believe there's no chance they're going to get in and they don't want to waste their vote. Firstly, the first thing that the negating team says is that small parties still get in, like Greens and ACT. But Greens and ACT are not small parties. They still have hundreds of thousands of people voting for them. So there are other parties that deserve representation out there. Secondly, they say that you don't need a specific party to have your views point across if you've got one specific person within a larger party to get that through. But the point is, like, that one person's views can easily get overruled. What's better is if you have a whole party that's within a coalition that can then hold the larger party to account and say, we really, really want this. That's far more realistic in terms of actually getting change. And finally, they tell you that, like, these small parties won't have much power within Parliament. But if that's true, then how can you believe the material about how it's going to gum up the whole system and make everything really inefficient? Those two things are totally mutually exclusive, because either the parties don't have much power, then they can't get anything done, so they don't gum stuff up, or they do have a lot of power, and then therefore they can get more stuff done, which we think is the realistic scenario in this debate, and I'm going to tell you more about that in the rest of my speech. But that totally negates the whole point. But secondly, we tell you that you would get greater minority representation, and this is really important. And the negating team didn't, like, engage on our mechanism for why this is really good, because we tell you that often parties treat ethnic minorities like the Pacifica in terms of the Labour Party as, like, a safe ground that they will always get that vote. So therefore they don't put much policy in the way of actually helping them out, because they don't have any incentive to actually win that vote back, because they believe it's safe. So often these ethnic minorities go highly underrepresented within these parties. It's not to do with them having, like, a hegemonic, like a monolithic interest. It's just they don't get represented very much because they're treated as safe ground. So we think that when they have their own party that they can then go to, that means that they have, like, they can actually hold governments to account and not be treated as safe ground, and never have policy that works in their own interests. That's really, really important in this debate, and NEG did not engage on that at all. So we get greater voice to minorities in New Zealand. So we feel that's really important because of the way that these minorities are treated often as safe ground. Like, Pākehā people have more of a political majority in power, which we really resent because we don't think it's representative. So what did NEG tell you in response on representation? Firstly, only have a few seats. So I've already dealt with that and told you that it's mutually exclusive, and so they don't get that. But secondly, they said there's heaps of members bills, and that gums up the system. That is, like, we like having more members bills because it means we get more representation happening. We get more legislation going through that represents more people. It's not a problem that there is more ideas within Parliament, because the point of Parliament is, like, process these ideas, get them across, and improve New Zealand. That's not a harm on our side. And finally, I'm going to tell you that it's really important for representation because of the principal point of upholding democracy in New Zealand. Firstly, we tell you the purpose of the parliamentary system as a whole, and, like, the structure that allows an MP to happen, is to represent people and ensure that their voices are heard. We tell you that when that breaks down, people lose faith in the system, they don't vote, and also they disengage with the whole parliamentary system as a whole, which is really bad for our democracy, because it means that the most engaged, like, the most privileged people in society are the only ones that actually are able to engage, so that means that only their views come across. So we think it's really important on that principle level to maintain the integrity of our democracy, so that we get a democracy that engages all people and actually means people get their views heard. Yeah,
What is the value of legislation that doesn't get passed?
We tell you that it will get passed, right? Because you get this legislation entered into the House, people can debate on it, and if it's an idea that people are interested in and think is for the public good, they will pass it. There's no evidence that it won't get passed. That's irrelevant. So let's then talk about efficiency. Because NEG gave us a few reasons why that it's less efficient. Firstly, that there's more confusion. Secondly, that parties create trade-offs. And thirdly, that we get polarization. So on the idea of it being confusing, so we get more stick in the system, we tell you that firstly, like, if you have one party who's, like, seemingly got a majority like the Labour Party, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a majority in the whole of New Zealand, right? We've already told you that because of the structural system that people get disengaged from politics, only a few people vote, and this perceived majority isn't necessarily the majority, so we don't think it's fair on principle for them to be getting that vote. We'd rather engage the rest of New Zealanders as we do under our model. But secondly, we tell you that parties still have an incentive to get legislation across, even when they're in a coalition, because they want to get back into government. So even if you are, like, New Zealand first, you still want to get some kind of stuff done in compromise with Labour on some fronts because you want to look like an effective party that is going to get into politics again. So there's still a strong incentive for parties to get legislation across. And finally, we tell you that it's actually really good that there is longer time spent on legislation and there is a bit of stick in the system, because that means you get proper scrutiny, lots and lots of debate to ensure that it actually works for everybody and isn't just representing one party's interests. That is utterly crucial that we get proper democratic scrutiny when it comes to the laws passed in New Zealand so that it's applicable to everybody, because that means that we get policies that work for more New Zealanders and not just the one majority that is represented in like the ruling party. And finally, we tell you that when we had extra parties as being responded to in our POI and we didn't get a response to that, and we have lots of choices for coalition governments, that means you can get coalitions that work together better. Okay. And then finally, on the idea of like, secondly, they told us about taking away promises. We tell you that parties just need to be more realistic than the elected promises. That's not important. Finally, on polarization, and how you're going to get extreme parties. Firstly, by the nature, like if you are a really extreme, there's not going to be that many parties getting in on extreme, because you still have to get like a decent number of votes to be able to get into parliament. It's not just every random view gets in. But secondly, like we think that it's really important that we get representation regardless, like because of the principle of democracy. Just because they don't like a particular party, they still deserve to be in parliament regardless of those views. And we think we do have laws like the Bill of Rights, like the hate speech laws that stop when things become really, really extreme. But we should allow people to get represented on that. And finally, they tell you that like the centre parties are going to shift away from the centre and go to the extreme. We tell you the inverse actually happens, because centre parties think, oh look, there's already someone covering that side, I can probably go into a coalition with them later, I'm going to appeal more to the centre. So we get more groups and we get more scrutiny because of that. And they use an example here about the US, which is a really bad example for them actually, because it's a two-party system, and they're only encouraging that on their side by narrowing the amount of parties, increasing the amount of polarization in the House because there are fewer parties. Finally, then, on political engagement, and they really didn't engage with this at all. This is a really strong standing cross on our side of the House. They tell you that voters will disengage because of the complexity of Parliament. We tell you this is simply not true. Our material is way more convincing here, because it's not that hard to understand that there are more parties in Parliament. It's probably more interesting also if more legislation is being passed and there's more debate. But we tell you that our material is more convincing because we're inspiring people to actually engage, because their very views are feeling representative. They feel as if their view is being held, like heard, and they're actually having their needs met to. That is way more important than their reason that they give you on their side of the House. They never engage on the ideas that people will also be more likely to run for office, or like engage in the select committee process, or sign parliamentary petitions, which increase the amount of scrutiny on the government and allow individual citizens to get their views across. So what we do on our side of the House is we increase scrutiny, we allow for more views, which is like fundamental to the democracy and fundamental to getting better policy for New Zealanders. So proud to affirm.
Thank you for that speech. Our next panelist, Sarah Sinclair's favorite Taylor Swift album is Speak Now. She's represented her intermediate school in a Vortex competition and is proud to be on the panel. I'd now like to welcome up the second speaker of the negating team, Keelan Husterman.
The Winston Peters handbrake phenomena is only exacerbated by having more parties in Parliament. 5, 10, 20, 30 more little handbrakes with 5, 10, 20, 30 different perspectives, ideas, bills, and people they're trying to represent. The place for 20 or 30 different ideas and things to be fought out is the pub, not Parliament, where we actually need efficient legislation going across the line, where we need people being efficiently represented. We need efficiency, we need people engaging with the political system, and the problems that need to be solved actually getting done in a timely manner, as opposed to just debating for far too long. A couple of things I'll do today.
Firstly, I will address the contradiction that we've had brought up by the affirmative side. Secondly, I will look at the efficiency of Parliament, what will happen when we have more parties, why you should care about this. Then I will take a look at representation. What changes on that front? Will it actually make a difference for those who need to be represented? Lastly, on political discourse and polarization, clear the air around that. Firstly, on the contradiction. So they claim that because we said small parties won't have a lot of power in Parliament, and then because we said they'll be bad for democracy, that was a contradiction that was obviously assuming that they do have power. First, this is just simply not true. They claim we were wrong on the basis that ACT and Greens both have hundreds of thousands of voters. We think that's just one niche example. There are far more small parties to be considering in this debate. We don't think it's a contradiction. You shouldn't care about this as a judge in the debate. On efficiency then. They told us that more kingmakers is a good thing. More handbrakes, more ideas, more discussion. But here's why that is not going to be the case. We think obviously ideas and debating is good. However, it needs to be focused, so it's not reckless. It needs to have a clear, reaching consensus and have a direction of where it's going, right? And so that's why having an opposition, their job is to try and push for that and keep it, making sure we're focusing on where we're going, pointing out the inefficiencies of the government and debating those sort of things, right? They have an incentive to win votes by advocating for the people that are losing out. That means that you have efficiency in terms of, and this is the third reason, is because if you have a government and then a disjointed opposition of, say, 10, 15 different parties, that means the criticisms to 15 different voices as opposed to, what, 3 like we've got now. That means it's less likely to be heard. The opposition criticism is going to have less weight as there's so many voices, and the ones that the media are going to pick up on are going to be the ones with radical ideas that are just wanting to get attention, as opposed to the genuine, actual, constructive, substantive criticism, which we need to hear coming through. So in terms of efficiency on that, it doesn't help. More opposition with 10, 15 different parties in there is not going to mean we're more efficient. It's not going to mean we have more scrutiny. And in terms of the efficiency then, you look, when larger parties have to have above 5%, right? They can focus and prioritize which bills they want to put forward. This is really important. There are less bills, but there are more serious ones because they choose which to prioritize because they have more people on board. When you have parties with multiple parties, each one will be putting forward their own member bills, right? So if you have 20 parties, that's 20 plus members' bills that each one are going to be due. Each bill then, when you have more of them, there's a less chance of it being pulled out of the biscuit tin that sits behind us over there. That's bad. We want effective legislation. We want members' bills and parties that are in there, selected by the people, to be able to get legislation through. There's a lower chance that your representative in your small party can actually get a bill through on your behalf. Plus the fact that it's less likely to be drawn is the fact that you're less likely to have cross-party support. The amount of work that goes into finding coalitions and getting support is humongous, right? And so if each little party is trying to band together with 20 or 30 other people to try and get the slim majority to pass their bill, it's time that's not going to increase efficiency. You don't get that on their side of the house. On representation, before I do so, I will take a pen away.
Why is a large party like Labour likely to support the needs of a minority group when it comes at the expense of your majority support?
We don't think it has to come at the expense, and I'm just moving on to that right now. So they told us that big parties don't represent the minorities. We said that just then, they don't have an incentive to because it might come at the expense of the majority. First off, we don't think that's true, and I'll start with my mechanism I was going to bring up last, but first, we'll start with this one, right? Voters generally now care more about minorities and how a big party looks after minorities than they do before. So even though majority people might be white middle-class voters, more and more are caring about how a party treats minorities, caring more and more about representation, right? That's testament to the popularity of the Black Lives Matter movement, or Pacifica rights, that sort of thing. Middle voters have an incentive now and more care about the minority, and they will support that in their votes. They'll vote for parties that do that. First one then, big parties know that they have a large voter base to maintain. They understand that there are diverse groups. That means that their policy platforms will try and incorporate as many of those groups as possible. But the difference between that and the comparative is that they're more likely to be able to get things done because they have the size, they have the power, as opposed to a small party with like numerous other people in a coalition. We actually get the legislation across the board. Secondly, big parties are actually currently in New Zealand have pretty good ethnic diversity. Obviously, we want it to get better, but there are Indians, Pacifica, Māori, Asians in Parliament, And these people all advocate for those issues, especially when you have high up ethnic diversity within caucuses like the Labour Party, for example, where we gave examples like Carmel Sepuloni and Calvin Davis. When they get higher up, it's easier for them to advocate. We get that on our side. And thirdly, minorities still don't only vote on the ethnicity of someone in power. They care about ideas, they care about the big issues like housing, economics, taxation, issues that affect every single person, regardless of which diverse group they belong to, right? And so we think these people will be weighing up these particular issues because they have the same vested interest that every single one of us does in terms of trying to fix these issues. So they're going to prioritize that, not just the ethnicity of their person. And so we gave you plenty of examples here about the incentives of a government big party to appeal to as many voters as possible. Now on political discourse. So they said that people perceive their votes to be wasted, right? And that's why they won't vote for parties like TOP, because they think they're not going to get to the 5% threshold. We think that in many cases, sometimes it's necessary. And this comes back to the trade-offs, right? It is important for people to make trade-offs in their voting. That's what politics is about. That's why we don't have a referendum for every single issue in Parliament, because we are electing people who, on balance, represent you most, are going to advocate for your issues the best. That's why we do that. Trade-offs are important. Why? Because it means that you're getting more people, parties instead to do that, because they're going to get more people to vote for them, and you're more likely to get traction on those issues again that affect every single person. Housing, economics, taxation, all of those sort of issues, right? And on the alternative, let's look at what happens there. What they have is they're far less likely to actually get things done, right? And so the wasted vote is voting for someone who gets in, stands up, has their 30 seconds of glory in Parliament, chucks a member's bill in amongst the hundreds of others, and then doesn't get heard from again, and you're not represented. Our alternative is that you can vote for a party that reaches 5%, a party that's going to have more backing, more people in it. That means when you've got someone who represents you in that party, they can push for that and get party support on that. You don't have to, or representative doesn't have to spend time trying to garner support from every single other party in Parliament. That takes time. They told us that people are more likely to switch off in politics because they disagree more. We think this doesn't actually hold much weight. People will switch off when they realize they're not getting represented properly. And in terms of extremism, right? We told you and gave analysis as to why it pushes the Overton window to what policies are accepted. More parties are going to be on the extreme right and breaking off from the centrist parties. Therefore, you get more extremists in Parliament, more extremists with parliamentary privilege who can lie and spread harmful material. We think that having majority bigger parties means there's that incentive for that not to happen. We don't get that radicalisation as much as they do in the comparative. I'd like to hear their response to that.
Thank you very much for that speech. Our next panelist, Nick Wilson, works for one of our honourable guests and is glad he has the afternoon off work. I'd like to welcome up the final substantive speaker of the affirming team, Tony Huang.
So this is quite a small table. I think it's right. We reject the majoritarian principle in governance that 51% of eligible voters should hold 100% of the power without compromise. We reject the premise that all it takes to get a major policy proposal through right now is an email blast from the party whip. Look, if in 2022, national leader Mr. Bishop wants a coalition, it should take more than a plane trip to Epsom. Sorry. Excuse me. 3 points of clash in this debate. Firstly, the impact on ethnic communities. Secondly, the impact on governmental outcomes. And lastly, on Polarization. So first I'm going to talk about the democratic principle, right? Because what we tell you is the democratic principle should never be compromised. We told you why at Julia that it is important for people to have a say in the powers that rule them. There is no compromise. What we heard from Second Nick is that there should be trade-offs in the name of efficiency. Look, when you're trading off democratic principles is what people say in China. It's what people say in Russia. It should not be what people say in New Zealand. We cannot have any compromise. So what that means is that if you think that principle means something, that we can intrinsically respond to any point they say by saying, well, sure, okay, yeah, but like, why shouldn't they have any representation? But even if you don't agree with that principle for whatever reason, that's what the rest of my speech is for. So firstly, let's look at the impact on marginalized communities. So firstly, I'm going to defend why they will form. Firstly, we reject the premise that we need all like Pacifica or Asian voters to back a party. All we need is enough to get like 0.8%, right? And that's very realistic. Let's look at what happened. Let's look at the real world. What we see is the Maori Party, a party which only got 2% of the vote, but was able to rally enough support from the public to come into government. And we think that is really, really good. And it only happens because the Maori Party is uniquely structurally immune from this 5% threshold because they have the Maori seats. That is something that we think is really, really positive for democracy and for representation. Something that should be extended to every other minority community. So they say that they say that people don't just focus like ethnic blocks, they also have their own views. Several responses here. Firstly, again, it doesn't matter if some Pacifica voters still want to vote Labour or some Asian voters still want to vote National. We only need like 20% of them to form a party. But secondly, we think that people actually do care about the identities. The fact that people voted for the Maori Party instead of the Labour Party shows that they thought there was something there. Firstly, because they thought their identity was important to them, but secondly, because those parties firstly tend to have similar policies to the majority party, right? The Maori Party has similar policies to Labour, but the thing is they prioritize Maori issues. They don't compromise on their constituency because that is who they represent. No compromises there. Secondly, even if it's absolute worst, all that we get is either like a largely like backbench party or one which sits just outside of parliament. That is still good. The fact that you have a party that can meaningfully take away votes from the major parties is good because in the status quo, there is very little chance that a lot of Pacifica voters will flip away from Labour or a lot of Asian voters will flip away from National. That means they have no competition. They are boxed in to have no choice. What that means is that they don't need to appeal to them. So that means that their priorities are ignored. But when there is a legitimate chance that they could switch to another party, that creates pressure. We see this in the Maori Party. One of the reasons Labour needs to put so much effort, put so much resources into things like the Maori Health Authority and Maori housing are because they work they complete support to the Maori Party. We think that this same logic applies when other communities have a similar level of representation. We think that this means that priorities which exist for ethnic communities, for example, like more Chinatown precincts in Auckland, or for example, having better representation of Pacifica culture, are priorities that are better able to be advanced when you have parties which aren't willing to compromise on them, as we've seen with the current parties. Thirdly, they say that they can never come into real political power. We reject this. 9 years of John Key's government was only able to govern because the Maori Party propped them up. We think these parties can have power. They do have power in the past. We reject the premise that they can never have power as a kingmaker status. Thirdly, they say that like it's good for minority. Thirdly, they say that this doesn't even matter because like middle class white voters now care about minorities. Look, think about what they're saying, right? They think that ethnic minorities should be at the mercy, be at the petty of middle class white voters to have their voices heard. That is what they're saying. That if a Pacifica voters want their priorities advanced, they just need to rely on that middle class white voters just happen to be in the mood to care about it today. That is abhorrent. We think that they should be able to advocate for their own rights, no compromises there. Lastly, why this is important. Firstly, we reject the premise that there's like a level of representation. Firstly, at best, you're getting like a few backbenches in the junior ministership for most communities. Right? Again, we think the exception is like there is a lot of like representation for Maori in the current Labour cabinet, but that is because the Maori party is able to act as a counterweight. We don't think that there aren't a lot of Asians, there aren't a lot of Muslims, there aren't even that many Pacifica MPs in Parliament because they aren't the swing vote, because parties aren't incentivized to prioritise them. We think that there should be more representation, especially given that we are a multicultural society with a majority white population. We think that they deserve more influence. So that is why it is principally important that we have a democracy which is able to represent the views of minority communities without them having to rely on the mercy of white voters. I'll take a point now before I move on.
How important do you think people currently living in poverty and the housing crisis think efficiency of policy is?
Okay, yeah, so that's my next point of clash, governmental outcomes. Firstly, let's talk about unstable government. Look, parties are incentivized to look like they're good at governing, right? Even if you're a minority party in a coalition, it is in your best interest to look reasonable enough that parties think that you would be good at government, because they don't look very parties to be in government, right? Both to other parties which could consider putting you in a coalition, but also to your voters. So we think that we don't have these radically unable governments, because either parties won't want to form a coalition with you, or just nobody will vote you in. But secondly, let's look at what they scrutiny and efficiency. Look, we think that scrutiny is incredibly important. Again, like I said, we don't think that major policy proposals should go through because a party were told 63 Labour MPs to vote for it, and that's all, and that's like at full stop. We think that it is good in a democracy to have scrutiny, to have parties say, wait up, is this really a good idea? We think that when this happens, you have better policy outcomes because parties have to think through what they're doing carefully. If Labour wants to put through a policy, it can't just be because it's a Labour Party policy and there's no competition, or the Greens will back. We need to have a policy which is good enough that parties genuinely believe it will have a positive impact for New Zealanders, it will have a positive impact for the communities. That is what we think good policy looks like. Not policies that are drafted in 2 months and put into law. We think that is harmful, we think that is dangerous, we think that is reckless. So, sorry about this. So anyway, so next up about disengagement, right? So again, what we tell you is that you disengage voters at the point where they aren't being represented, they're not engaged with the process, their views aren't being heard. We also think it is good that they say that it is harmful to have 15 voices talking, criticizing something. We think that is a good thing. We think it is good to have more perspectives, more criticisms from different angles. They say that the media will just intrinsically focus on these really crazy parties. We reject that. We have good enough faith. We have enough faith in the media to think that they won't just do this. And we look at how the media treated a party like NZIER. They ridiculed them when they were going insane. That's what the media does, because the media is incentivized to not look like they're pandering to radical extremists. So lastly, when it comes to polarization, look, the only example that they could give us is the example of the US, a two-party state. That is not a good example. That is an example that actually harms them. We think what we say is that when they also say that when you have fringe parties, that just means that political parties will try and go to the right or the left, like Labour or National will just go. But what we actually think is more likely is that you'll have centrist party that emerges if they think that Labour or National is going too far. You see that under Don Brash, there was a lot of power put in United Future because there were centrist voters who thought that the National Party was going too far to the right, who wanted a centrist voice, and so they voted in the centrist party. That is what democracy looks like. That is how a democracy should function. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Our next panelist, Zachary Wong, is 22 years old. He is also an enthusiastic homeowner from Auckland. The final substantive speaker is Emily Horsfall. Welcome.
In order to win this debate today, the opposition has to prove two things. They have to prove that firstly, they get more representation of minority views in Parliament, and secondly, that this representation actually leads to legislative change. Because we don't buy their point that all views have to be heard in Parliament on principle, especially since we heard from Keelan that we don't give a referendum to every issue. Therefore, the individual voter voice is not a principal right that everybody has in political discourse. Three main points for you then today. Firstly, representation. Secondly, effectiveness. And thirdly, engagement in politics, probably the least important in this debate. So firstly, on representation. They came out at first and told us that minority voters under the status quo tend to vote for secondary interests because they feel less represented by major parties. But then they also told us that major parties consider these people a safe vote. This is a massive and blatant contradiction on their case, and I'm going to explain to you what the reasonable and true outcome in this world is. Major parties know that minorities aren't always satisfied with their point.
That means that these are swing voters. They are people that could go to either party depending on what policy best fits their needs. And that means that both parties have a unique incentive to appeal to minority voters in order to capture that vote, especially since swing voters are actually the most crucial voters in an election because they decide the outcome, right? Your loyal voter base of Labour Party is never going to just randomly switch to the National Party because you made a slight change to your policy. You'd have to go extremely radically different from usual in order to do that. And this means that they can't be a safe vote. Minority voices get represented on our side. So what's their comparative then? They split this voice. They split it into hundreds and hundreds of different small little parties that are all going to have absolutely no power in government. And that's something that we don't want on our side. So what then did they say? They told us that Labour put in Maori healthcare policy because of the fear of losing votes to the Maori Party. That literally explains my last point, right? People know that they could lose the vote to, Labour knows they could lose votes of Maori people to the Maori Party. They know that they could lose votes of Pacifica people to the National Party if they don't appeal to them. That means that they will always do that. And again, these people are not homogenous, which means we need to appeal to not only Pacifica people who want to vote left, but Pacifica people who want to vote right. That is something we do by having a Labour Party and a National Party who both have an equal roughly half percent voice in Parliament. Secondly, they told us that Maori seats mean that Maori people are represented. Again, great. That's a really good point for our side as well. We have those seats and we have them under the status quo, and if that gets representation, then we'll create Pacifica seats. If that works, we'll create seats for different minorities, but I've given you strong analysis there under our side. So what do we then tell you on the effectiveness of these parties once they actually get into government? So firstly, on polarization. At first they told us we're going to have more parties who are better able to work together in coalition, which doesn't engage at all with what the comparative is, which is just not splitting the vote of people who generally agree but may have some slight different views. The Labour Party and the National Party currently are made up of MPs who all have different views. Those people, however, have a unique structural difference to their opposition comparative, which is that they all, at the end of the day, know that they will vote along party lines. They'll have their discussion, they'll have their debate, they'll hear all the unique voices and the voices of each MP that represents each specific region of their electorate and stuff. And then they will come to an agreement. Their side just means that there's no guarantee that we'll ever come to an agreement. They might just end up blocking all legislation because they have to end up getting their incentive is to get their policy through. Whereas now their incentive is to hear all the voices and get Labour policy through. On the alternative, each party's incentive is to get their unique and individual policy through because the voters they're trying to convince are their voters who vote for their niche, not like the majority voters, which is how it works under the status quo. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Doesn't the fact that the Maori Party presents a critical threat to Labour's Maori voters prove our point that ethnic parties are more effective at holding major parties to account than other major parties?
No, it doesn't. It proves that sometimes there are parties that are smaller, like the Maori Party is able to gain enough support in order to be a tangible threat to Labour, and it just really just proves my point that yes, if parties, if ethnicities feel so left out, a particular ethnic group in a society feels so left out by major parties that they have to form their own party, if they can get enough support, which we think they can, then they will get over the 5% threshold. However, I've given analysis on that, which was more structural than your random unique example that you just gave me there. On efficiency then, Julia said that small parties have an incentive to get policy across. That was not our point at all, okay? Our point was not that small parties don't have an incentive to get their policy across. Our point was that small parties have an incentive to get their policy across and not the party that they're coalesced with, because obviously New Zealand First doesn't want Labour to get all their policy across and not New Zealand First policy. They want their voters to be represented. And because those interests always clash, that means that they're uniquely always going to be blocking policy. And that means that the Labour Party was less effective and less efficient at passing policy to deal with the housing crisis because New Zealand First didn't want it to get across the line. We think that this is horrible in today's debate. We want a parliament that can actually get legislation over the line. And we explained to you why smaller parties are also going to become less effective because they are less able to, they're way less statistically likely to get a members bill across the line, and the members bill that do get across the line are less likely to be good and the best, most prioritised members bills, because it's harder to get parties to come across lines and actually cooperate when there are so many more parties. You're likely to just get a massive influx of members bills that aren't actually necessarily the most important ones. Then they told us that more time means better policy. So basically they here conceded throughout the debate, and it's not good enough for them to then substantially change their case at reply, that policy will take longer. We think that yes, we do have scrutiny currently because we have opposition parties. What we tell you is that on our side, we have a unified opposition party who has one voice that opposes the government party's one voice. And what this means is that we are able to easily follow this criticism in the media. The scrutiny is easy for the public to understand. That is something that you do not get on your side. What you get is policy that has a lot of bickering over it. You get lots of niche parties that have different issues with government policy. All of them are trying to get heard by the media. All of them are trying to appeal to voters. That means voters don't actually know whether they should change their vote based on that legislation. So governments are actually able to get away with bad legislation, but it's also likely that legislation will take a really long time to come into effect because of the amount of infighting in their coalition. That's really bad for two reasons. One, we can't waste time on crucial policy like fixing the housing crisis, and two, we want actually good policy that's easily understandable to voters so that they know whether they should vote for that party in the future and hold governments to account. Then we told you a point on polarization and how we're likely to have lots of different parties moving more radically left, more radically right. They didn't actually engage in that. They engaged in a totally point that we didn't even run about hate speech, which wasn't something we were talking about. We're talking about polarization, meaning it's harder to cross party lines, harder to come to an agreement between Labour and National currently, who can sometimes cross party lines when there are really important policies that need to get across, as opposed to a radically left, radically right party divide, which they will never cross lines for, even on reasonable policy. Keelan gave you mechanisms for that, and they gave you analysis for that at first and second. No response to that in today's debate. What this means is that we don't get good engagement in politics. We make it convoluted. We get no policy, and we just get our focus on sensationalist and radical parties in the media because of sensationalism, incentives in media to gain profit, and therefore we don't help democracy. We only harm it.
Thank you for that speech. And before we move to the reply portion of the debate, I'd like to introduce the final panelist. This is Lucy Harrison's 11th year at Nationals. She's been attending this tournament almost 4 times as long as the Bay of Plenty has had a team. As is traditional in debating competitions, at the reply portion, we halve the speaking time and we give the speeches in reverse. So I would like to welcome up the leader of the negating team, Ned Brown.
To buy A's case, you have to believe that we live in a world where all business owners vote National, all unionists vote Labour, and all Māori people vote for the Māori Party. But this isn't the world we live in, and this isn't the policy we want. 2 contentions we won to win this debate. Firstly, the impacts on the democratic process, and secondly, representation of minorities. I'll start with representation of minorities, because this was the main benefit, main thrust that SIDAV gave us in this debate. They told us that minorities need their own party in order to be represented. We gave you lots of reasons as to why this isn't the truth. Is why this isn't the case or shouldn't be the case. Firstly, that it's far better to have Māori representation or minority representation in these big parties where these people are at the top of these parties. Because when all Labour's Pacifica supporters go out and vote for the Pacifica Party, all that does is remove Labour's incentive to protect the Pacifica people that already vote for them, right? They want to hang on to the votes that they already have, and if all those Pacifica voters then leave the Labour Party and vote for this other party, then that gets rid of their incentive entirely. Secondly, that not all minorities vote the same way. We constantly heard this like categorical erasure of minorities time and time again down the line from South Africa in this debate. That's just not true. Like, minorities have their own political perspectives, and the fact that they are just going to band behind one party altogether was just not a reasonable assertion to make in this debate. But thirdly, all this material was absolutely and entirely contingent on their ability to prove that any of these small parties actually are going to have a tangible impact at delivering, at being able to deliver outcomes and policy that will affect these minorities' lives. We tell you this doesn't happen because, firstly, they're most likely just going to be an irrelevant backbencher party because they have a very small voter base, very small seats, not much influence. But secondly, even if they're in an instance where they are in a coalition agreement, we tell you, actually, no, they told us that there's going to be lots of these small parties to be in these coalitions when they gave us the material that there's more parties to choose from to get together. All this means is when you have lots more parties in a coalition, that those interests get diluted and that policy gets diluted during that negotiation process. So on no account do they improve the outcomes of minorities on this point. So clearly then, they didn't prove their main benefit in this case, in this debate, so they can't win on benefits. Secondly, SIDE need to win this debate because we show you how their policies are tangibly going to harm the democratic process. We did this right at first, and we told you that when you get more parties in government, it totally degrades the quality of the democratic process. Firstly, we tell you that coalitions are way less effective, gone over this already, but you have more voices, more interests, more policy to appeal to. That makes it more confusing. More policies get traded off, more voters have their promises broken, and get more instability among these coalitions themselves. So then we also gave you that you get massive amounts of polarization. Firstly, that it creates division among people and party bases. The only response to this was that USA was a bad example. This never engaged with any of the actual substantive or structural material we gave you as to why polarization is bad, as to why division is bad. They didn't engage with that at all. But secondly, we tell you that it totally ruins parties' ability to cross the party floor and make policy together. Things like the gun reform that we saw last year, they never engaged with us once in the line, never engaged with us once during the debate, and so that benefit totally withstood any of their case. And thirdly, we tell you that members' bills are the main way which small parties currently have power. All that does is get diluted on their side. Why is this the case? Because currently small parties prioritise certain members' bills, they put resources behind them, and they go out and communicate with other parties in order to get support for these members' bills, because a members' bill from a small party is going to need support from a big party in order to pass. All you get on their side is far more members' bills. You get more of a congested system. Statistically, it's less likely those members' bills will be selected. Ultimately, you get less power and representation of minorities. You get a more convoluted and less efficient democratic process. We cannot stand for their policy. Very proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that speech. And for the final speech of the 2021 National Championships, I'd like to welcome up the leader of the affirming team, Julia Randerson.
Panel, I want to start my speech by telling you about the stakes of this debate, because our democracy is the way we run our government touches the lives of every single New Zealander in this country. It must be the most representative that it can to get the most impacts for everyday New Zealanders and ensure that not only the most privileged and most represented in our status quo have their voices heard and their needs met. Two things to do in my speech today. Firstly, talk through NEG's path to victory and how they don't achieve it, then go through ours and why we do. So NEG claims to get a better democracy in two ways. Firstly, by getting better efficiency, and secondly, by proving that the small parties won't have power. So firstly, on efficiency, they say that it will be too slow, there'll be too many bills, and there'll be lots of polarization. But we prove that this is not true. We tell you that it is unlikely to be slowed down significantly because parties still want to look good. The reason that New Zealand First was voted out of office, for example, is because it was being inefficient. People thought that it was bad, so they got rid of it. There's a strong incentive to not do that. Secondly, on the idea of too many bills, we say this is just simply not true. The more voices we hear in Parliament, the better, the more debate we get. the better. We twist that into a benefit on our side. And thirdly, on polarization, we tell you, they say that we've got no responses apart from an example, but we tell you that we actually get more centrist parties on our side, as Tony explained to you. We also stop the kind of polarization that happens on their side, where you get two parties that end up collating so many different views that actually end up being non-representative in the first place, so that doesn't stand. Secondly, on small parties not having power. Note that they automatically lose this point because small parties will always have more power and therefore more ability to be represented on our side, because they simply don't let them have anything at all, so that's not a good way for them to win. But why is it, even if it is a true thing in this debate, why is it untrue in their case? Firstly, that can't be true, because we already pointed out a contradiction they never responded to, that if small parties have enough power to block up the democratic process, then clearly they don't have no power, so that just falls down. We tell you also that the way that coalitions work is that when you enter into a coalition, every party has to agree on the policy before it goes through. So of course these small parties have power when they are coalitions. That does not stand either. How then do we win? Firstly, on representation, we have two parts to victory. Firstly, on representation, we tell you that minorities are often seen as safe votes by mainstream parties. So when we give them a voice through their own party, the ability to create an own party that is viably going to get into parliament and introduce threat to major parties, that introduces a threat to major parties to get change, and they also have their voices across. The only response was that, the Māori party has, there's a Māori health authority in the Labour Party, but that is actually our point and mechanism, right? Because the Māori party created a threat to the Labour Party, so they made change. Their example works for our side. We get more representation for, and they said that if minorities really cared, they'll just create a party, but that doesn't engage with our whole case, because the minorities don't have enough people to create a party in the first place. We let them do that on our side. And secondly, on engagement, this is also really important and another way to win, because we can get so many of the voters who don't vote, which is 20% of the actual available voting population, to engage more, because we actually inspire them, give them a voice, feel that they are represented, so they're more likely to actually engage with the democratic process. They had no engagement, basically, on this whole issue in this debate. This entire thing stands entirely and is so important. The only response here is that it's going to be too confusing when there's more parties in Parliament, but that's simply not true, because it's not that hard to understand. That characterization is not standing when we tell you that our comparative incentive is that people feel represented, feel as if their voice is heard, and feel better about engaging in the democratic process. Through that, we get thousands and thousands more New Zealanders actually voting, having their voices heard, and scrutinising, crucially, the policy through things like select committees, through things like petitions, when we engage them in the democratic process, because they feel like they're actually being heard. So at the end of this debate, in the world under our mood, NEG proved maybe at their best a tiny bit of delay in passing controversial policy within the House. We tell you that we are so happy to make that trade-off when on our side our benefits are a more representative democracy, more ideas that represent all people within our coalitions, and that result in policy that tangibly improves the lives of so many more New Zealanders so proud to stand.
Thank you very much for that speech, and can we have a round of applause for all of the finalists? The judging panel will now leave the room to deliberate, and while they're gone, we will hear from some of our honourable guests. The first guest I would like to invite up is President Koch.
Well, it was a short walk to this debating chamber across Molesworth Street this afternoon. They say you can't beat Wellington on a good day, although the Hawke's Bay team will be hoping otherwise. It certainly wasn't a good day out there. As I walked from the law courts on my side of the street to Parliament on this side, I call these two places the temples of the voice, because they depend and they respect very much on verbal persuasion. It's a very good place then in this temple of the voice to hold a debating final. First time I met our current Prime Minister was in this hall when she was a member of the Waikato Secondary School's debating team. The next time I met her, she was the coach of the Waikato team. Chris Bishop, who is sitting in front of me, the shadow leader of the House, one of our most able parliamentary debaters, I first met here as a secondary school debater. Nicola Willis, who was sitting here until a moment ago, was also a tremendous secondary school debater. And indeed, if you were reading the Dominion Post on the weekend, you would have seen an interesting article in which someone was recording, I suspect it was Wayne Eagleson, recording the time that Nicola was given the job of playing Helen Clark in the practice debate against John Key and completely discombobulated him. She was that good. Of course she was. She was a secondary school debater in Oregon. Amongst the judges on the other side of Molesworth Street, you have people like me. I didn't do my secondary school debating because we didn't really have this kind of competition when I was around, but certainly university debating. And of course, your own Claire Ryan, who was, I think, one of your life members, was a secondary school debater. You have barristers like Jeremy Johnson, Tim Stevens, and Jonathan Scragg sitting in the front row. Some of our best advocates trained in schools debating. And sort of sitting in the middle, perhaps the middle of the street, like a character from the Monty Python for Yorkshireman debate or skit. You have people like Chris Finlayson, my old friends, who kind of skits back and forth between the parliamentary side and the barristerial side. We, priests of the Temples of the Voice, will say to you that we began our careers, we started our careers here, debating. Confidence, what debating gives you is confidence. It gives you confidence to make an argument in front of a crowd of strangers, sometimes quite a hostile crowd of strangers, sometimes the home advantage really stands. And it's one thing to be clever in the marshalling of an argument, but it's another thing entirely to be comfortable in the presentation of it. And the most persuasive speakers always seem to be at ease, even when they're faking it. I think debating has never been more important than now. In this social media, electronic media world, where we seem to shout at each other and operate on snapshots of information leavened heavily by doses of prejudice, debating is important. People are communicating out there without trying to persuade each other and without trying to listen either. The days of day-long oratory with spellbound listeners is gone. No one has the time for that anymore. No one has the attention span. After 5 minutes of listening to a speech, we tend to try and look at our phones to see what important emails have come through, including, of course, numerous offers from gyms and offers of yoga, all sorts of other things we couldn't possibly miss, but we have to look at every 5 minutes. Well, debating here in Parliament and the courts is the medium that dispels nonsense. It teaches us to grasp a good argument and expound it powerfully. It teaches us to grasp a bad argument and to explode it in 3 forceful points. No wonder debaters populate Parliament. No wonder they populate the courts. The importance of debating in Parliament is obvious. In the triennial elections, the leaders' debates assume a real importance. And it's no surprise that it is some of our best debaters who end up occupying the 9th floor of the Beehive. Debating produces power. And so it's true also of the law courts. When I became president of the Court of Appeal 5 years ago, one thing we had noticed was that the leading counsel tended to be male and senior, and the junior counsel tended to be female and younger. And we thought it was time to make some changes. So we introduced something called our junior counsel policy, which says that we expect to hear from junior counsel. Instead of them preparing the argument and listening to their leader messing it up, we expect them to come into the courts and actually deliver part of that argument. And we've seen it. And funnily enough, what it's meant is we're seeing more women on their feet arguing important parts of the case. Probably parts of the case they wrote. They probably wrote the whole of the case. But this policy has made some real improvements. And I can tell you that on an occasion when I was sitting as the ring-in judge in the Supreme Court, we saw a young female counsel stand up and completely rescue the case that her leader was in the process of messing up. So it is wonderful to see that. I tell you, as a judge, there is nothing more satisfying than seeing someone, a good advocate, change your mind. You come into the case, you've formed a bit of a view about it because you've read the papers. You can't read the papers and not form something of a view. And then a good speaker, a good debater, a good advocate changes you around. It's the most satisfying feeling you can have as a judge. It's what debating does. So I want to say today, I want to express my great appreciation to all the debaters in this competition, to the organisers and to the judges. What you're doing here is not just pleasant recreation, it's important work too. You'll find it important if your careers take you next door to the House of Representatives or across the road to practice in my particular temple of the voice. So I thank you very much indeed for inviting me here. You've had a wonderful debate today, a really fascinating debate, superbly delivered by 6 very, very capable speakers. So my congratulations to them, to all of you in this competition. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for listening to me speak.
Thank you for your kind words. The next speaker I'd like to invite up is the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, Lawrence Kubaik.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, I am an Aucklander. I don't have a dog in this fight. And when this wonderful organisation was founded in 1988, I think the year was, I was already sitting at bedsit in South London wondering what on earth I'd done with my life and how I'd ended up here. So I never debated at school. So I came to this afternoon without any real expectations and with the wondering of how I would be surprised in the course of the last hour or so. And I wasn't always surprised. I mean, I did expect some silver tongues and some purple emotions from the 6 young people you see in front of you. But I didn't expect, interspersed throughout that hour, 15 minutes, let's say, of top quality open mic stand-up from the participants in the debate. So I had some wonderful surprises on that count as well. And it left me with the view that whatever path that you follow in life, and we've just had 2 strong recommendations, one for the law and one for the world of politics. And indeed, we heard from the Prime Minister when we started this weekend on Friday night that one thing that you could all aspire to, you who have been debating throughout this weekend, is to be sitting in that chair. I would recommend that you set your sights a little higher than that, but it's achievable. I think with the skills that you have honed to perfection, not only over the last weekend, but previously throughout the competition, there are so many things that you could do in your life where you will find those skills so valuable. If I just draw 1 or 2 examples from my life, I'm not a lawyer. I've had as little to do with politics as I decently can. Sorry, Mr. Bishop. But I was a commercial negotiator in multinational companies for many years. So I've sat across the table with people with a different view of what they wanted the outcome to be and whatever it was that we were doing. And you need the same kind of imaginative sympathy in those situations, being able to see the other person's point of view, see the vulnerabilities in it, see how you might respond, that you've seen on display tonight. So that's just one simple example from my own commercial life. It used to be said that the valuable thing about the study of literature is that it allows you to develop that empathy with people who are not like you in so many ways. They come from different places, different cultures, different time periods, but you can enter into their emotional life and understand them through the study of literature. I think we see that in a similar way with a debate. You have to understand the other side, you have to listen to them, you have to respond, you have to think of what it means for you. And in life, those things are so very valuable. So whatever the time from this point on, I think we can prophesize with absolute confidence a bright future for everybody in this room, apart from those of us who are old enough that a bright future is actually way behind us. But certainly for all you young people in the room, I think what you've been doing over the last few days is one of the most valuable things that you could be doing to set yourself up for success in any path that you might follow through life. On behalf of the Institute, on behalf of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, I say thank you again for allowing us to participate and support this wonderful occasion. I hope we do this for many years to come. It's been an absolute pleasure to do it, and thank you so much.
Lawrence, and on behalf of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council, would like to extend another huge thank you to the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. Every speaker, reserve, coach, judge, and supporter is grateful for your ongoing support and for bringing us this brilliant final today. The next portion of this event, we wait for the judges to return, is participant speeches. We'll be inviting some of our brilliant speakers up to share their experiences at the tournament. And the first participant would like to welcome up from Northland is Ronan.
Tina Koto Katsuo, I'd just like to congratulate the competitors again on what was a really fantastic debate today. Good job to both of you guys. For this final here to be possible, a lot of people had to come together and dedicate so much time to bring 12 teams from across Aotearoa, New Zealand to our capital here. I'd like to thank the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research again for sponsoring this debating nationals and making the competition possible. I'd like to thank the conveners, chairs, and judges who made sure that the tournament ran smoothly. Of course, thank you to my irreplaceable coach Liam and my teammates Nick and Joe, even when they would steal my ideas and leave me without a split point. And shout out to Auckland White, whose argument against girl boss culture somehow out-girl boss outside the house as well. Over my last 3 years at Nationals, I've made lifelong skills and lifelong friends. I learned the importance of listening and communicating. Unfortunately, I did not learn the importance of bringing an umbrella to Wellington winter, which that was a hard lesson to learn today. But before I finish, I'd just like to leave with a quote that speaks on what I think debating is all about. He aha te kai o te rangatira, he kōrero, he kōrero, he kōrero. What is the food of the leader? It is knowledge, it is communication. I think this perfectly encapsulates the values of debating, crucially of listening to what your opponents are saying and then effectively communicating your perspective. And I think the finalists have done a great job of that today, so good luck to both teams and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ronan. Our next speaker hails from the Central North Island. I'd like to welcome up Mia.
Tēnā koutou katoa and good afternoon everyone. My name is Mia Perkins and I'm a member of the Central North Island team. One of the great things about being from a 5-person team on Wanganui is actually that the whole population of Wanganui has been able to come and join us here today. It's also one of the first competitions we ever been mistaken for as whangarei, so we'd like to extend our thanks for that as well. We'd also just like to extend and echo the thanks to all the adjudicators and coaches here today who probably gained more grey hairs and they've given up their time. Never in my life did I think that buying a stuffed toy as a mascot would ever be so controversial or time consuming. What's going to happen to our mascot is still under hot debate. Wellington toy stores, I'm so sorry. I'd also like to extend a massive thanks to the competitors as well. We're really lucky to be here in person as well, considering the online debating we had at Nationals last year. Having watched the debate in Parliament, it's probably got a bit more prestige than watching in my living room. So thank you for everyone being here today as well. It's also been really great to get to know everyone as well. Turning out, waiting hours for an elevator in the Travelodge Hotel was great for bonding, although I think everyone agrees the hash browns came in a close second. I can't imagine the countless hours in preparation and time and effort you've all put in, and I think it's truly testament just as the great quality of debates that we've seen throughout the weekend. I know it's something that we'll definitely carry with us for a really long time and something we appreciate so much. Maybe something our parents won't appreciate when we respond to them with 3 mechanisms when they come home after school today. Massive thank you to the finalists as well for such an engaging debate to close off a really amazing weekend, and just a massive safe travels to you all back home to your regions after the finals today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. And then the final participant speech today from Auckland Blue, Isaac.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you after this final of Nationals 2021. I think a couple of things made Nationals 21 such a special occasion. The first of that was that it was in person this year. I think that after last year and having a year of predominantly online debating, we all appreciated the opportunity to be with each other in Wellington, debating back in places like Parliament, Wellington schools, and the university. I think that the little things like being able to chat with the other team after a debate, being able to stay in the same hotel as each other, enjoy the buffet breakfast, are what makes competitions like these so memorable. And so I think that we're all glad and so happy that it could go ahead this year. I think the second thing that made it so important was the greatness of the motions that we had. I think that the motions that ranged from education to US politics to feminism to MMP in the final really tested our knowledge in a diverse range of areas and kept a lot of us on our toes. I know that the third speaker on my team, Jack, was particularly happy the sports motion got in there with the Olympics. I think the final thing that made this year such a great experience was because of all of the help that we had from a range of people. And when writing this list of thank yous, I got to more people than I thought I would, because there are so many groups that made this event possible. I think firstly to Mr. Bishop for hosting us today, thank you very much. It's such an amazing experience to come and have a debate and watch a debate in a place like this. I think secondly, to all of the judges, members of the council, conveners and chairs, Lucy and Izzy, thank you for all of the work that you've put in to make this event possible. A lot of it's behind the scenes, and I know that we don't always see it, but we do definitely appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thirdly, to NZIER, thank you for your support this year and making this event possible. The commitment to public debate that you show is really encouraging, and it's awesome to have a sponsor like you on board. Fourthly, to all of the coaches of all the regional teams who put up with us on weekend practices and endured nervous 1 hour preps when we were debating this weekend, thank you for your tireless support. Particularly thank you to Paul, Jess and Aisha, our 3 coaches from Auckland Blue. Thank you for all the effort that you've put in. You've been amazing coaches. Finally, to all of the other competitors, thank you for making this competition so memorable and keeping us all on our toes and having such an amazing experience. Particularly, congratulations to the 2 final teams. There was an awesome debate. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you and this opportunity to enjoy the final. Thank you.
Cool, thank you very much for that speech. We'll now just be waiting for the judges to finish deliberating, so feel free to have a chat, move around, and I'll come let you know when the judges are ready. Seats, please. Thank you everyone for your patience. I would like to welcome up the Chief Adjudicator of the tournament, Maddie Nash.
Hi everyone. First, I'd like to begin by congratulating both teams on an excellent debate. Another round of applause for them. I'm going to be announcing the prizes, but first we'll hear from the chair of the panel, Tim Bain, who was one of the deputy chief adjudicators at the tournament, to give us the results. So here's Tim.
Thanks, Maddie. The panel agreed that this was as expected and as is usual an absolutely fantastic debate, and both teams gave it their all and were just brilliant. So I'll just ask for another round of applause. The quality of the debate was reflected in what was universally seen as an extremely close debate, and the fact that the panel, as is also traditional at nationals, was split. So please congratulate the winners by a majority decision of the NZIER New Zealand Schools Debating Championships 2021, really long mouthful, Wellington Black. President Koch to come up and present the winning team with the trophy. So once again, congratulations to Ben Peno, Julia Randerson, and Tony Plum. Also ask if His Honour can please present the runners-up trophy to Hawke's Bay, Ned Brom, Keelan Easterman, and Emily Horsfall.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, President Koch. So now we'll move into the individual speaker prizes for the weekend. So I'd like to invite up Lawrence Kubiak from the NZIER to give these trophies to the people and also the certificates as I pass them to you. And actually first, just another thank you to NZIER for sponsoring the tournament and for making this possible. I think the spectators really enjoyed coming along today. I've had a great weekend. I think the students have had a great weekend, the coaches, and all the judges really. So thank you very much. So our first individual speaker prize is for the most promising speakers of Nationals 2021. And this year we have jointly awarded the most promising speaker, which is the Rosemary Dixon Cup, which Tim will find. So the first awardee is Alan Mitchell from the Bay of Plenty.
The same school as my wife.
And the second awardee is Sophie Crozier from We now have a number of highly commended awards. So these are for speakers who we were really impressed with throughout the weekend. I mean, we were really impressed with everybody, but particularly impressed with. So the first of these goes to Ned Brome, who saw in action today from Hawke's Bay. The second of these goes to one of our semi-finalists today from Waikato, Andrew Q. And our third highly commended award from Northland goes to Ronan Painda. We now move into naming the New Zealand team, and first we have two reserves to this team. So I'm going to announce them in no particular order, they're just the two reserves. So the first of those is to Guy Williams from Auckland. And the other reserve to the 2021 New Zealand team, also from Auckland, is Jack Sandelin. We then have 5 speakers who will make up the New Zealand team that will represent New Zealand at our online Worlds this year, and have lots of training over the coming weeks and months in the lead up to Macau Worlds. So I'm also announcing those in no particular order. So the first member of the team from Wellington is Tony Huang. The second member of the team from Hawke's Bay is Emily Horsfall. The third member of the team, also from Wellington, is Julia Randerson. The fourth member of the team, who was in action this morning in the semi-finals from Auckland, is Isaac Mallis-Flynn. And the final member of the New Zealand team from Canterbury is Callum Hackett. We now have 2 further awards that have trophies attached to them, and I'd like to invite up Chris Bishop to present those. So the first trophy is the award for the captain of the New Zealand team. So the captain of the 2021 New Zealand team from Auckland is Isaac Mallis-Flynn. And the final award is for the best speaker of the 2021 National Championship. And this year that goes to Tony Huang. I will in a moment hand over to Amber, but I would just first like to say a big thank you to Tim, Shaked, Rebecca, and Tamara for being on the Edge call this weekend. It was fun coming up with motions with all of you, doing the selection for the prizes, a bit stressful at times, but really great, and I think we should give them a round of applause for all of their work.
Thank you. And just before we let everyone wander off, final thank you to all of the participants at the tournament, in particular to our adjudication core, to our conveners, Lucy and Izzy, and to the president of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council, Sam O'Grady, for all of their hard work in making this tournament happen.